Hey everybody, welcome to What the Flick. We are recapping Netflix's Stranger Things, the whole shebang, all 8 chapters.
Stranger Things have happened.
Indeed, but not today. Tim and Bibbs and Alonso, and I fucking love this thing like everybody else in the world. I know it's a cliche to be like, oh my God, Stranger Things, but I adore this. And not because of it being a greatest hits mixtape of the 1980s, because
that's why I love it.
Okay, and that's valid.
Very
that's
surface
valid.
area.
I know there's all these
shallow.
There's all those articles out there that are like they pinpoint every single reference, whatever. Like, and that's great. And if you want to play that game, fine. But I genuinely got into it on just a pure dramatic level. I love these characters. I got into the story. I got into the whole. I got a little choked up at certain times, you know, when Elle says friends don't lie the first time, or when they put her in the that sensory deprivation tank, and Joyce is like, you're doing so great, you're so brave, and you realizing that fucking Matthew Modine never said that to her one time, you know, I got a little verklempt, yeah. So I dig this thing, and I think that my take on the 80s-ness of it is going to be a little different from y'all, because you guys perceive the 80s via the media of the 80s, whereas I'm old enough to have actually experienced the 80s.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, I recognize the John Carpenter music cues, and I recognize the Stephen King references and the E.T. stuff and whatever else, but also a lot of it, because the period detail I think is so smart, and just the ambience of the whole thing called to mind life of the 80s and not just movies and TV of the 80s.
Well, and again, I was in my single digits throughout most of the 80s. So this was a lot of the way, you're right, this is a lot of the way I experienced the world, was through the media of it. So I grew up on things like The Explorers and Stand By Me and Goonies and The Monster Squad and The Last Starfighter. And in many respects, Stranger Things is a greatest hits pastiche of all of that. And people are calling it shot. Sometimes the show is even very direct about it. But I kept watching the show, and I was into it. I didn't dislike it. I like the show, but I had the same feeling about the show that I had about Super 8, which is, here is a loving homage to a period of time, but also a sort of a stylistic period, made by people who obviously have a lot of affection for it and who obviously know what they're doing, and yet I'm watching this, and I'm seeing nothing added. There's nothing that's being added to the canon. It's just being remixed. I'm not seeing a series with anything really cohesive to say about this pastiche. I just see them evoking it and doing their own version of it. And there's nothing terribly wrong with that. But I felt very little while I was watching it, other than this is somewhat interesting.
Well, like somebody tried to change your life with a mixtape, and you're like, I heard all these songs before.
Yeah, kind of, a little bit.
But did you want it to be more of a commentary on the period, or did you just want something?
I wanted it to be something.
Okay.
I wanted it to have something to say.
So on a pure story level, it didn't work for you?
On pure story level, I've seen all of these plot points before, and so nothing came as a surprise.
I don't know. I liked the fact, and again, and I'm sure you can quote chapter and verses, all the stuff where this has been done before.
Sure.
And some of those things I will recognize, some of them I won't. I've never seen the Goonies, people. I apologize. So there's, you know, for me, the idea that, for example, that Hopper at some point gets on board and understands that Joyce is actually telling the truth and isn't nuts, you know. I always find it interesting when they can work out a way for the unhelpful authority figure to become the helpful authority figure.
Sure.
I like the fact that Steve is not the total asshole that we immediately assume he's going to be. I like how the relationship between Nancy and Jonathan progresses, and that they don't necessarily have to fall into each other's arms, but they can still be there for each other and support each other. I fucking love Barb!
Barb is the shit, okay? We all like Barb. Barb is the Martha Plimpton of this series, and we're all very, very happy about it.
And my one disappointment of this is that we have to go too long without knowing what happened to Barb. It's like,
I thought it was pretty clear that she died. I don't know.
Well, eventually, yeah, but there's a period there where you're like, well, okay, if Will's still around, where is Barb?
Barb never communicated with anyone.
Ask Will about Barb.
There was never any evidence that Barb was still around like Will was, so I just assumed she was dead, and then the show told me it was supposed to be like, you were supposed to wonder. I'm like, I didn't wonder, you gave me no evidence.
All right, fine, be that.
I didn't really wonder either.
Yeah.
Getting pulled into the pool is...
But yeah, but I want to make it clear.
I was holding up hope because I wanted Barb to be okay.
As was Nancy.
And I want to make it clear, I'm not saying it's a bad show. I just feel like I feel like people who maybe weren't thoroughly ingrained with these stories, like you, who didn't necessarily watch them all when they came out, or younger audiences who've weren't
never
around
seen
in the
them
80s,
before.
who'd never seen them or only saw them piecemeal. You know, it's one thing. Yeah, I saw Goonies. You know, I saw the Monster Squad, but you didn't see them when. You saw them when there was a whole bunch of other stylistic decades to work with.
Right.
You saw them in the midst of the 90s when children's and young adult storytelling was very different. You saw them in the 2000s when the storytelling was very different. It was an antidote to that.
And you didn't watch them 8 times on HBO.
Exactly. They weren't on every single weekend. And
Right.
so I suspect that younger audiences, people who are in their teens and 20s or even younger if you're allowed to watch it, are probably getting this all of a sudden, just this wave of 80s stylistic and storytelling ideas, everything from Stephen King to John Carpenter to Steven Spielberg to everyone who ripped all those people off. They're all getting it at once, and it is kind of intoxicating to be just awash in the style of a previous generation. I feel like it's almost, in a weird way, kind of like what Mad Men was doing, where it's just like we're just all of a sudden we're just trapped in a different era.
Right.
And we're just feeling that era play out, and not in a ironic way, not in a look. You know, there's occasional joke.
Although
really.
Mad Men was
Different
used, yeah, I mean they used the trappings, but not necessarily the storytelling style of the period.
It's not a perfect metaphor.
I was thinking about Tarantino actually, and I think you're right. I think that for stuff like this, there are certain gaps of generations of people who are going to dig it for one reason, and then for another reason, and then the ones in the middle who aren't.
Yeah.
Because, for example, I remember when Grindhouse came out, I was excited to see it. A critic I know who's older than I am was saying, "Oh, I reviewed actual Grindhouse movies in the early '70s. Like he was over it. Like could not be like not a thing he wanted to revisit at all. You know. So I think you might be right. This is probably appealing more to either older people who who experienced the '80s as teenagers and above, and younger people who have only a smattering of an idea of what was going on in that decade. But yeah, I think though that it offers a lot, and it's not just pastiche. In the same way that, again, with Tarantino, you can identify all of the that kung fu movie and this exploitation film and he's still telling you a story and he's still doing something interesting. I think that even if you can spot all the It and Goonies and whatever else references, I still got into this story and was captivated by it. And I don't binge a lot, but once I got into about episode 4, I was like, I can't stop until I know how this is.
I do not dislike this show. Okay. I just didn't have a very strong reaction to it, and for a while I thought it was simply, I just recognize all these references. It's just me, sort of being kind of in tune with it and just not seeing anything original. And then what I realized was all of the things that it's referencing or the good stuff anyway, are about something. Like even Firestarter, which is not terribly well remembered, but it's a huge influence on the whole 11 storyline.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
If you read that book, and especially if you watch that movie, which is I'm more familiar with than the book, it's about like the war for a child's morality. And you look at something like The Monster Squad or The Last Starfighter, and they're very specifically about the strength of childhood passions and why they can have practical value and why they matter. And then I watch, or like It, which is about childhood fears and the way that they continue to shape you. And I'm watching Stranger Things, and I'm struggling to find a cohesive theme because they are throwing in different elements from very different types of stories, and they're weaving them in a parallel fashion, which is interesting from a story perspective. It actually reminded me of a very different 80s movie, Blood Simple, in that everyone's going about the same plot in different directions, and no one knows all the same information. Structurally, that's kind of neat. I was digging it. But because everyone's story was had a different emotional core and sort of a different plot, the way it was handling the plot, they weren't really exploring the same idea. They were exploring the same plot. And as a result, I really didn't feel anything for it. It didn't feel very cohesive to me. It felt like I was watching a plot without a theme.
See, I found each angle of that plot to be really interesting. I thought what the kids were doing was cool. I liked the relationship dynamic about, Mike and his caretaking of Elle and how Dustin and Lucas responded to that. I liked again the Nancy Jonathan thing as they were sort of pursuing their own track, and then the whole thing with Joyce and Hopper and how Joyce is so driven to desperation. I love those scenes where she goes into the store where she works and she's like, "Look, you got to advance me. I've done all this for you, and I need this now." also a pack of camels. You know, I thought there's and they were butting up more against the sort of government conspiracy stuff, certainly via Hopper, where he's actually investigating and going into the dangerous places. So to me, it felt like I was getting different threads, but each of those threads was interesting in and of itself.
And I agree that they're interesting. It's real fun. They're agree that they're interesting in and of themselves, and certainly all the performances are hitting fine emotional beats.
Yes.
I just don't think that they cohere very well, except on a plot level.
I was okay with them being separate because I found a way to identify with each of them, and maybe it's just that the age I am is kind of right in that sweet spot. I remember being a kid in the late 80s, early 90s, and doing those things, riding bikes, playing Dungeons and Dragons, feeling the way those kids felt. I remember being a teenager in high school, you know, with emotions swirling and not admitting that you like someone, and I'm old enough to imagine what it would be like to lose a kid. So I can identify with all of those performances separately, for sure, and you're right, they don't, tie together terribly thematically well, but I think that they all work together separately, which is a weird sentence.
Well, again, one of the things that Stranger Things feels the most like, and I think it's because of the long-form format, is all of the various Stephen King miniseries that we had over the years. And there are good Stephen King miniseries, your It and The Stand, and then there are the not-so-good ones like the Tommyknockers. And I kept watching this, and I'm like, better than the Tommyknockers. But it's not really like, the only thing that was keeping this from being a Stephen King miniseries was an alcoholic novelist and a hypocritical preacher. Those are the only two things. Otherwise, this is totally a Stephen King
when
miniseries.
I saw the font, I immediately thought, is this a Stephen King adaptation? Like, is this the sequel to Needful Things, Stranger Things?
I think it's a Peter Straub book. Like, that's what it feels like.
Yeah, so I was kind of open to whatever. And then by the end of the first episode, I'm like, oh, okay, I see what we're doing here. But yeah, I could. For me, it worked on its own.
Okay.
Let's talk about the performances, because the kids are uniformly so great in this thing. I mean, everybody is terrific, but I think...
At first, I was afraid that they were Goonies ripoffs, because they seem to have the same tropes. But at the same time, I thought they embraced them really well while giving us more than just Chunk did.
Yeah, I felt like all four of those kids had genuine inner lives. I believed them. I felt like I knew them or was them at some point.
Which one were you?
Mostly Justin, probably. But and the thing is, they always say that a lot of times kid performances are created in post. You know, the director just has to shoots a ton of footage and has to edit and find us like the best moments. But then you have to multiply that by 4 kids, and a
whole season.
Exactly.
Not just one movie. Like
this is an 8-hour thing. So obviously they were bringing it, I think, to some extent, because they would still be editing if they were, I think, having to work around these guys. So they were amazing. Winona Ryder, I mean,
so good.
Our treasure. I mean, I just watched Heathers again, and 80s Winona Ryder is great, obviously, and will always be iconic. But 2010's Winona Ryder is really bringing it. If you saw HBO's Show Me a Hero last year, she's just dynamite.
She was great in Black Swan.
Great in Black Swan. So good in this.
Winona Ryder disappeared for absolutely no reason, if you ask me. She was great in the late 80s. She was awesome in the 90s. I mean, not everything she did was amazing, but I will put her in Little Women up against any performance in the 90s. She's fantastic in that movie.
Yeah.
And then just in the 2000s just weren't terribly kind to her. I know some people blamed the whole shoplifting thing, and I'm like, if that happened today, no one would care. Like, if a Kardashian did that, it would be a one tweet, and then everyone forget about it in an hour.
Right.
Like, it's
something new would come along to take its place.
It's nothing. She did nothing to lose our faith and our trust and to lose good roles, because she's a really talented actress, and she is one of the reasons Stranger Things works as well as it does. I honestly think the kids are great, but the kids are kind of mired in their sort of kids storyline. I feel the same way with the teens, who's just like, we got to do the losing the virginity and turning on your friends, and one of them's a bully, and I'm an artsy kid, and no one appreciates me, and they're doing a lot of the cliches. The real emotional core of this is Winona Ryder, and it is David Harbour, who is, at first, I couldn't get my bearings with his character. He just seemed like kind of this crappy
boozy sheriff,
Yeah, and then he just started caring. He just started giving a shit about his day job and the people around him.
Yeah.
And it got to like him more and more and more, and I started respecting his character even when he did things I didn't necessarily agree with. And I think he's been one of our really rock solid character actors for so long with little or no appreciation. And it is so nice to see him really get a moment to shine. And this is his series, this is Winona Ryder's series, and everyone else I see is a supporting cast member.
And Matthew Modine, very effective villain.
Playing David Cronenberg.
Yes. Oh, and the lady who's always pretending to be from social services.
Yeah. Very
She's
threatening.
chilling as hell,
She's
that lady.
great. Oh my God.
And the guy from The Nick who plays the restaurant owner. That was, you know, he's only got a handful of scenes, but he delivers.
We didn't single out Millie Bobby Brown as 11.
Millie Bobby Brown, my God.
Has a rough role. And honestly, like, I was really glad because they kept hovering around certain cliches, certain storytelling cliches, especially from the 80s, but just in general in kids storytelling for her, where it's like, oh, we got to dress her up in a dress and a wig. And I'm just like, oh, she's going to discover her femininity now and lose all of her character, like what happened in a lot of these. And no, actually, she's still great and interesting, and it doesn't like just reduce her
and
to
actually,
the female,
that reminded me of the moment where Gertie is putting makeup on E.T. and dressing him up.
It's like the same outfit.
Yeah, kind of, you know. But yeah,
they're not subtle.
I agree. Like if you go back and watch like Disney's Swiss Family Robinson, there's like the girl who. This movie, there's a girl who's been pretending to be a boy to live among pirates. Make of that what you will. But the second that the Swiss Family Robinson like puts her in a dress, like she stops riding horses or being active or anything, and just wants to like hang out in the treehouse.
There's too many stories that with a female protagonist, with at least with a strong female character, that end with and now she's in a dress and everything's fine.
Yeah.
Like even Lara Croft Tomb Raider, the Angelina Jolie movie, ends with she finally gets rid of the boy shorts and the tank top and she's in a dress and that's the happy ending. And I'm like, fuck off, Lara Croft Tomb Raider, the movie.
It's the Ali Sheedy syndrome.
Yeah. Like seriously, she's so much cooler in The Breakfast Club before she gets the makeover. Or Barbara Streisand in The Mirror Has Two Faces.
Sure.
She's way more appealing before that makeover.
Nonetheless, I think, yeah, you're right. Elle is better than that.
Yeah, I think she's better than that. She's more interesting than that, and she gives a really good performance. All the acting is fine. And again, I think the pieces are fine.
Yeah.
It's just they didn't cohere as well as I would have liked. I mean, what are your thoughts? Do you feel like it has a cohesive theme, or do you feel like it's working on a different level?
I don't know that I was necessarily looking for one. I mean, give me an example of what you would think the theme of this kind of thing would have been.
Well, for example, one of the things that they sort of toy with is the sort of defensiveness of it, like the idea of people trying to protect each other, and it doesn't actually fit in every single storyline, but they introduced the idea early on. It was just like, yeah, but Will threw Firebolt. He tried to protect us all, you know? And then everyone's trying to protect him after the fact, but that's not really an idea to explore. It's just one plot point.
I think you could make the case that everybody in this movie is willing to sort of put themselves on the line to save somebody else.
Yeah.
The kids are willing to risk everything to try and work this out. You know, Nancy and Jonathan are willing to go into the Upside Down, as are Joyce and Hopper.
But that's just a consistency. How does it explore that? That's my thing. I don't know. I've been looking. Like I've been trying to find. I don't know that
I need one. I think it's effective storytelling, and I think it even if you boil it down to go to the place and get the guy, you know, it's still it is treated as the tragedy it would be for a kid to disappear, and it is a quest that has a lot of difficulties in it, you know, and obviously it leaves us with some unanswered questions so that we can continue with this thing.
Yeah, no, again, I think it's effective plotting. I think storytelling requires more than that. Like I need more than just a bunch of cool stuff happening for me to care, especially over this much time.
Me neither, I guess. I guess I don't. All
right, that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. It's just that's what didn't work for me. And it's the one missing piece that kept this from going from well produced to really great. That's it. I'll shut up about it.
And that's fine. I'm sure you've watched lots of things over the years that had many more missing pieces that were in many ways successful.
Sure, to an extent, but I wasn't necessarily asked to be emotionally invested in the Transporter 2.
Okay, but I would say that the plotting and the characterization is strong enough to give this resonance for me, even if I don't necessarily have some big thematic thing to tie onto it.
And I think even with the rehashing of 80s plots and storylines and tropes, I think there was enough intrigue and mystery and they fed it to me at the right pace that I did, you know, keep hanging on what they were saying, wanting to know more, wanting to discover as they were discovering.
Yeah.
To figure out what was going on, to save the kid, but also solve the mystery, to reveal what the shadowy organization is doing and what their stake in all this is.
Right.
Let me ask you a question. So we've reached the point now where we're sufficiently far enough away from the 80s that we can do an entire series that's just in the style and the storytelling tropes of the 80s, and it feels different and novel, and it is getting people excited about 80s storytelling in a way that even movies that have been doing this for years, like It Follows or Drive, have not. Cool, fine. what's the 90s version of this? Like in 10 years, when someone's doing a TV show that's just knocking off all the plot points from Clueless and Seven and The Silence of the Lambs.
Airborne?
Airborne? Oh my God, that would be so tight.
It'll look like Airborne.
Oh my God, the last episode is just a rollerblading race. It's going to be so cool. I love Airborne. I have no apologies for Airborne.
I almost see it as a revisiting of the classic 90s blockbuster movies, like your Terminator and your Alien and like...
Well, that was 80s. Alien was 80s.
Well,
Alien
T2,
was 80s.
though.
Alien 2 was also 80s.
T2.
T2 is fine. I'm not arguing with T2. I was
Right,
saying
no,
Alien doesn't quite
fair
fit.
enough. But I'm just saying.
It's fine. Yeah. But like Independence Day, you got that. You got Twister, Speed. You know, there's a lot. There's a lot.
Yeah,
Yes, okay, good.
Armageddon,
Thank you for better examples.
The shitty Godzilla, you know.
I just someone was already typing in YouTube Alien Keymed blah. Like I just wanted to cut you some slack. Yeah.
Gibbs, help me out here.
Yeah.
So
Actually, I think what's going to happen is people are going to start nailing what the early Sundance aesthetic. You know, like starting at Sex, Lies, and Videotape in '89 and moving forward.
to Slacker, Reservoir Dogs. Yeah, that'd be cool.
with those movies, and even like the sort of the new queer cinema of the early '90s, like those kind of super low budgety but still on films. You know.
Yeah, that'd be kind of cool. Actually, I'm not gonna lie.
Yeah.
I totally dig that. I think that's awesome.
I think that's the next thing to
Let's do
dig
that.
into. I have to call out the one anachronism that I caught in Stranger Things. One episode ends with the Bangles cover of Hazy Shade of Winter, which was not recorded until 1987. This was set in 1983. But that was it. That was the only one I could bust them on.
The music choices, I think everyone's really just loving how carpentery the score is. And
Yes.
it's very carpentery. I found that for every time the music was perfect, there was a couple times when it seemed not. Like their use of, it was a cover of Heroes. When they find Will.
Oh yeah,
and it
that
just
didn't feel
totally
right.
felt entirely wrong. It's a song that even in that cover evokes a certain amount of triumph, and it wasn't even offering like an ironic counterpoint or some sort of meaningful contradiction. It was just the wrong song to play.
It's also been
White Rabbit
really
felt out of
overused in the
place,
last
too.
few years.
Even with the cover, it doesn't it's like doing that one Hallelujah.
Okay,
like,
that one
like
too,
the most
yeah.
overplayed song in history.
So I didn't hear, what did you say was misused?
I thought White Rabbit, if I'm
yeah.
A little bit.
A little on the nose.
A little
I thought, with
exactly,
Red Rabbit.
right,
yeah.
it didn't feel thematically right. It just felt content-wise right.
Right.
Yeah, but mostly music is pretty rock solid, honestly.
No,
I think
definitely,
The score for sure.
Now,
Yeah.
I've still not really researched who are the Duffer Brothers.
They did a horror movie called Hidden, which I have to admit I haven't seen.
Okay. And they
Not
worked
to be
on,
confused with The Hidden, which was an awesome 80s
Oh,
movie
yeah,
that this
yeah.
movie that the show doesn't evoke.
okay. And they worked on Wayward Pines, is that what I read?
Did they?
That's what
I
I thought I heard that.
Wayward Pines, a show which I actually wish we reviewed because I actually really dig Wayward Pines.
Ah, well.
Wayward Pines is actually has Wayward Pines is actually about something.
Oh,
I'll tell you that much.
There are places online where you can find out who these guys are, so go do that. You don't need to hear from
Yeah,
us.
and also Sean Levy also did a lot of work on the show. He executive produced it. A lot of people know him from his
Is
sort
he
of
the terrible Sean Levy?
He's the Sean Levy.
There's only one. Okay.
He did
The
like
Pink
Cheaper-
Panther remakes.
He did
that
Pink
guy?
Panther remakes. He did Cheaper by the Dozen.
yeah,
The Night at the Museum. It was, but
This
to
is
his
where I leave you.
to his credit, he also did Real Steel, which I felt was somewhat underrated.
No.
Real Steel?
Only you think
Real
that
Steel.
film
I
is
am not the
underrated.
only one who every 10-year-old kid I've ever met who actually saw Real Steel likes Real
All right.
Steel.
Well,
a lot.
this is Sean Levy's ticket out of hell, as far as I'm concerned.
this is more Real Steel Sean Levy than anything else Sean Levy has ever done, and thank goodness. He also directed an episode of Birds of Prey.
Oh, well,
I found that out recently.
Good
I
to
found that
know.
out show on my podcast.
all
yeah.
right then.
Yeah.
Fascinating.
Who knew?
All right. Is there
Vaguely
anything,
interesting.
anything else we haven't covered
I mean,
here,
there's
or?
so much to cover. We would love to.
Yeah,
do
I mean,
this.
there's
every
any
episode
number
has
of
stuff.
Absolutely.
We didn't really talk about the mythology of it too much. The idea of the Upside Down, which is obviously basically the ring world from the Lord of the Rings by way of Silent Hill, which is actually a '90s, early 2000s reference. That's not actually an '80s reference. Silent Hill. Jacob's Ladder didn't even come out until, like, what was it, '91?
That sounds right.
Yeah, like it's pretty.
But I'm
yeah.
sure there were other sort of dank parallel universes before
One thing I think
Silent Hill.
One thing
right?
I think is interesting when you talk about the idea of you define a decade by the art within it, you kind of got to realize that the 70s didn't stop at the end of 79. They went on for a couple. Like the 70s died like halfway between Friday the 13th Part 3 and Friday the 13th Part 4. The aesthetic is entirely different, but that's the cutoff right there. That's when the 80s became the 80s. So like the early 90s are actually sort of fine.
Which
I think.
Jaws movie started the 90s?
I don't think Jaws got to the 90s.
No, I remember Spy Magazine.
You got me there. That's good. I like that.
Spy Magazine had a survey one time where it was like, where did the 80s end? And one of the choices, or where did the 80s begin? And one of the choices was the release of Elvis Costello's first album. One of them was the New York Times article about mysterious gay cancer. And one was the inauguration of Ronald Reagan. I was like, you're right. It's never an easy, clean cutoff point.
The 80s at least continued as far as Cool as Ice.
Okay.
There's no way. Cool as Ice, I don't care what year in the 90s it came out. That's an 80s movie.
That was the last gasp, perhaps.
All right, Stranger Things.
Yeah, share your thoughts in the comments. I'm sure you have them.
Most people love it. A few people are kind of with me. They're kind of eh. But like, it's still well produced, and I recommend seeing it. I did like it. Yeah.
So thanks for joining us. And we're going to be doing more of these. We'll be talking about BoJack Horseman and some other Netflix stuff in the near future. So come back and check us out.